My guest at this time is Matthew Staver, chairman of Liberty Counsel. Liberty Counsel is providing the legal defense for Sandra Merritt, who you might remember, along with David Daleiden, is facing charges in California in connection with the undercover investigation that captured Planned Parenthood officials and others openly discussing abortions that led to the procurement of fetal organs and other tissue for research labs such as STEM Express. But as Daleiden and Merritt battle the system, we're learning more about what actually happens to the unborn in this process. We're also learning more about the accusations against Daleiden and Merritt. And Matt, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Well, we're getting some major admissions from the CEO of STEM Express, who is referred to in these court proceedings simply as Doe 12, but she is featured by name in the CMP videos from 4 years ago. She is admitting that often she requests intact fetuses for research, and the reaction I'm seeing from across the pro-life spectrum is that means, at least in some cases, these babies are born alive and then their organs are harvested. Is that assuming some things that might not be true, or is that what it means when we hear fetuses delivered intact?
That's exactly what it means. The better the specimen, in their words, the better the body part that's intact and whole, the more they can get for the sale of that body part. And that's what they sell to STEM Express and other entities such as Stanford University. In fact, Doe 12 has now admitted on the stand that she sold some of these intact body parts to Stanford University, including intact brains. In order to have an intact brain, you have to have it attached to the body and then remove it after the baby's outside of the womb. So these babies are being butchered alive. We also will have information about beating hearts, that the hearts, once they're removed, have to remain beating, which means that they're beating at the time that they're removed, and they continue to remain in a beating state through artificial electrical stimulation until it gets to the research and other specimen labs. So what we're talking about is killing, butchering live babies for profit.
I hate that I even have to ask this, but is this legal or illegal, whether it's in California or anywhere else?
It's illegal, and that's one of the issues here. That's why Sandra Merritt and David Daleiden wanted to do the undercover investigation. There's a couple of exceptions to the dual-party consent rule in California for recording. One is if they're done in public places, and they're admitting that these were done in public places where people could overhear the conversations. Therefore, that's an exception. And the other is if the person doing the recording suspects that the person being recorded is engaging or about to engage in illegal activity. That's also an exception. Both of these apply in this case.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. What exactly is the charge against your client, Sandra Merritt, as well as Mr. Daleiden? What is the law that California is hinging this case on?
Well, it's outrageous because it's the first time in history any person has ever been charged like this. And that's why the Los Angeles Times editorial board blasted the Attorney General when these charges were originally released, because they understand the implications against journalists. The charge is that the recordings invaded privacy. In California, there is a two-party consent rule. In other words, under most circumstances, or the general rule, I should say, both parties have to consent to the recording, but there's exceptions to that. And the exception would be if the recordings are done in places that are public, where there's no expectation of privacy. That applies here because that's, in fact, what happened. And they've admitted that these recordings were in public places, at restaurants and conferences and other places where people were coming up to the table where they could overhear the conversations. The other exception to the dual-party recording requirement is if the person doing the recording suspects that the person being recorded has engaged or will engage in illegal activity. That's an exception. And you would want it that way, so that that's what journalism does. It ultimately reveals these kinds of issues, and therefore there's no journalist ever charged with such a crime in the history of California, except for Sandra Merritt and David Daleiden. The only reason is because, not that they broke the law, they didn't, but it's because they want to protect their friend, Planned Parenthood, the abortion butcher of the world.
We're talking with Matt Staver, chairman of Liberty Counsel. And Matt, one of the other things that happened already in this case, and I believe it may have been with this same witness, was blowing up the narrative that these videos were, quote-unquote, heavily edited or doctored in some way. From what I understand, it's basically been testified on the stand that what was released was pretty much what the conversation was.
Yeah, what was released was the conversation, and that has now been admitted on the stand under oath, so that is clear. In fact, Planned Parenthood and others tried to suppress the showing of these videos by saying that they were doctored and they didn't contain the whole conversation. Now we know, and we knew then, but now we know because of it comes out of their mouth, that they're admitted. These are actual conversations. They are not doctored. They're not fixed. This is what they said. This is what they did.
What does this mean for the larger debate now? Is California going to be out on its own limb here? Is the intensity of pro-choice policy in some left-leaning states so intense that others will follow suit? What do you think the fallout's going to be, and how much does it hinge on the outcome of this case?
Well, I think that certainly it would be a tragedy if misjustice takes place here and that Sandra and David are convicted. They didn't do anything wrong, and the implications are staggering for First Amendment journalism, not just in California but around the country. But whatever happens in California, we know doesn't stay in California. As radical as that state is, California policies have ultimately been picked up by other liberal states, although there may be just a handful. They begin the process, and oftentimes that begins in California. So we have to really watch what's happening there because it could set a national trend.
What's it been like to deal with the state of California on this case, not just for bringing these charges that even the Los Angeles Times, as you pointed out, said a very troubling precedent, but just in how they're engaging with you as counsel, as well as Mr. Daleiden's counsel? I think they're from the Thomas More Law Center. What's it like to deal with them, and what kind of price emotionally and financially are these folks dealing with?
Well, it's a huge economic cost, and certainly Sandra has to live with this every day in terms of the implications of this, but she is at peace in terms of dealing with the highest, most powerful law enforcement agency of the state of California, and they're putting their entire operation behind this to convict these innocent individuals. That is troubling because they are putting incredible resources and conspiring with Planned Parenthood in the process to not only bring this criminal case, but also to encourage, I'm sure, and certainly partner with Planned Parenthood in their civil case. Because once this preliminary hearing on the criminal case ends, we go right into a 4 to 8 week civil trial in California with Planned Parenthood that they've filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Sandra Merritt and David Daleiden.
And finally, Matt, let's just circle back to where we started, and that's with these abortions, intact babies, literally having their organs harvested while they're still alive, which is hard to even fathom. But assuming the state of California won't do anything about this new information, who can?
Well, certainly what has happened with STEM Express is some local prosecutors have gone after them and some other organizations. They've been fined millions of dollars. Some of them have been put on the edge of bankruptcy, and some of them have become bankrupt. But I think what we ought to see is something coming out of the Department of Justice. We called for this early on. The Planned Parenthood has been referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution and investigation, both by the U.S. House and Senate. And we need to have some action from the U.S. Department of Justice.
Matt, we'll be watching. Thank you very much for your time today, as always.
Thanks. My pleasure. Bye.
Matthew Staver, chairman of Liberty Counsel. Liberty Counsel providing the legal defense for Sandra Merritt, who is facing charges in California, along with David Daleiden for those undercover videos of Planned Parenthood and STEM Express and others back from 2015. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.